FBI firing. An update on Peter Strzok, the federal agent who sent messages slamming President Trump while he worked on the investigation into possible collusion with Russia. Rejecting pro-lifers. Why Democrats in one state just shut the door on voters who want to protect the unborn. Cardinal Parolin. What the number 2 man in the Vatican has to say about world issues. And the next generation. The Holy Father delivers a message to nearly 100,000 young adults in Rome. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, August 13th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. One of President Trump's favorite targets at the FBI is out. Agent Peter Strzok investigated whether Hillary Clinton inappropriately used a private email server and investigated whether Russia interfered in the presidential election. But it's his text messages, his anti-Trump text messages, that made lawmakers and voters question his independence. President Trump did not hide his disdain for Strzok. Shortly after the news broke this morning, he tweeted, "Just fired Agent Strzok, formerly of the FBI, was in charge of the crooked Hillary Clinton sham investigation. It was a total fraud on the American public and should be properly redone." The president has called the current Russian investigation a witch hunt and believes the FBI should have focused its attention on his opponent instead. Strzok was involved in both high-profile investigations but was kicked off special counsel Robert Mueller's team a year ago. After it was discovered, he sent text messages to his lover, Lisa Page. The two apparently talked about stopping Trump from becoming president. House Republicans grilled Strzok about the text messages at a hearing last month.
It is not my understanding that he kicked me off because of any bias, that it was done based on the appearance. If you want to represent what you said accurately, I'm happy to answer that question, but I don't appreciate what was originally said being changed.
I don't give what you appreciate, Agent Strzok. I don't appreciate having an FBI agent with an unprecedented level of animus working on 2 major investigations during 2016.
Strzok's attorney calls the text messages free speech and says his firing should be deeply troubling to all Americans. House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy says Strzok's firing was long overdue. President Trump also lashed out at a former Apprentice star who worked for him at the White House. He says, quote, wacky Omarosa, Menegalt Newman, has been, quote, fired for the last time. She wrote a book called Unhinged, which is very disparaging of President Trump, but Omarosa is also taking flack for secretly recording conversations at the White House, including in the Situation Room. Critics denounce the recordings as a serious breach of ethics and security. The president travels to Fort Drum, New York to sign the defense bill, giving the military a big boost.
Next year, already approved, we have $716 billion to give you the finest planes and ships and tanks and missiles anywhere on earth. Nobody makes them like we do.
The spending bill is named after Senator John McCain, a Vietnam veteran who often clashes with President Trump and voted down his plan to end Obamacare. Despite their differences, both men agree on the need to support the military. Pro-life Democrats need not apply. Missouri Democrats disinvite pro-lifers from the party. Dems in the Show Me state hold about a quarter of state, House, and Senate seats. Pro-life Democrats, in what's being called a battleground state for the midterms, predict their exclusion will hurt the party. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. The Missouri Democratic Platform Committee approved language this summer that said the state party supports abortion, but it left room for members who are pro-life. This weekend, the Democratic State Committee held an emergency meeting and eliminated that part of the platform. That's upsetting some pro-life Democrats.
Former State Representative Joan Barry introduced the clause, welcoming pro-life Democrats. is something that we deserve. We're not second-class citizens. We want to be full-fledged, acknowledged in our party. I think we would win more votes if we had that.
Her plank read, "We respect the conscience of each Missourian and recognize that members of our party have deeply held and sometimes differing positions on issues of personal conscience, such as abortion." But then, in an emergency move, the Missouri State Democratic Committee scrapped it.
There's no official accepting of pro-life Democrats. We just need to be listed along with that long list of people who are listed as being in the party. And it's everything you can imagine are in the party, and that's wonderful. But to ostracize us because we believe in life is pretty ridiculous and very sad, to be honest with you.
On the national level, the group Democrats for Life tells us rejecting pro-life members makes no sense.
I mean, it's unbelievable that all these members have said that they're not going to vote for Speaker Pelosi, and she's still supporting them. Yet people like me who say that we want to protect life because we believe it begins in the womb, they don't want us, and they are showing us the door.
The 2016 Democratic National Platform for the first time called for the end of the Hyde Amendment, which bans federal funds for abortion. Day says that isolated millions of pro-life Democrats, and they want their party back. Kristen Day says she hopes other state parties will change their platforms to welcome pro-lifers. And Joan Barry, that's the Democrat who tried to change the Missouri platform. She tells me she hopes to get it passed again. Lauren?
How will this move influence this battleground state's Senate race?
Well, former Obama White House staffer Michael Ware criticized the state party in Missouri, as Democrats there need as many votes as possible in what will likely be a close Senate race. The Real Clear average of polls says Republican challenger State Attorney General Josh Hawley just inched ahead of Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. Cardinal Sean O'Malley announces a major investigation into a seminary in the Archdiocese of Boston after allegations by two former seminarians. The exact nature of the accusations has not been made public, but the cardinal says the men witnessed and experienced activities which are directly contrary to the moral standards and requirements of formation for the Catholic priesthood. The rector, Monsignor James Maroney, has been placed on immediate leave. For more on this story, including a look at who will lead the probe, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Secretary of Defense James Mattis arrived in Brasilia, Brazil, last night on his first diplomatic visit to South America. Brazil and the U.S. are the Western Hemisphere's two largest democracies. Mattis says the U.S. is working to expand partnerships where it's mutually beneficial. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reports from the Pentagon. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Secretary Mattis' tour of South America comes as the region is dealing with political and diplomatic upheaval. The Pentagon is concerned this could have a wider destabilizing effect, which is why security will be Mattis' top priority. The Pentagon chief arriving in Brazil for the start of a week-long diplomatic tour focused on mutual security threats. Brazil is the first of 4 stops. There, Mattis is meeting military and national security counterparts. Brazil's health ministry has launched a nationwide vaccination campaign to protect children from measles and polio. This after a measles outbreak in the north, where thousands of Venezuelan refugees are crossing the border to flee their country's economic and political crisis. Many Venezuelans are sick and haven't been immunized due to a failing health system. Mattis' second stop is Argentina. It will be the first visit by an American defense secretary since 2005. Pro-lifers in the majority Catholic country have been celebrating since Thursday, when their Senate rejected a bill that would have allowed elective abortion in the first 14 weeks of pregnancy. His next stop, Chile. There, Chilean prosecutors have expanded their investigation into alleged abuse by Catholic clergy members. Pope Francis earlier this year publicly denounced a culture of abuse and cover-up and has accepted the resignation of some Chilean bishops. Mattis' final stop is Colombia. There, he'll visit with administration officials of the newly elected Colombian president, Iván Duque.
Una nueva generación motivada por el servicio y no por el ejercicio vanidoso del poder.
The 42-year-old Washington, D.C. educated lawmaker is the youngest person to be elected to the country's presidency. Venezuelan refugees are likely to be the focus. Just like in Brazil, tens of thousands of Venezuelans have fled across the border, with more coming every day. The Trump administration says Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, and his socialist government is to blame for the humanitarian crisis. Over the weekend, Maduro said he would allow FBI officials to come to Venezuela and investigate a failed attack on his life. This, even though Venezuelan authorities allege that the perpetrators of the attack were trained in Colombia and that some were being harbored in Florida.
The other big topic Mattis will be talking about at each of his stops is security concerns of Nicaragua. Now, thousands of Nicaraguans continue to flee their country since a crackdown on protests by President Daniel Ortega. The current unrest began in April when Ortega imposed cuts to social security system, and small protests by senior citizens began, and they were actually violently broken up. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the Pentagon. Thank you, Wyatt. Security forces in Egypt stop a suicide bomber from attacking a Coptic Christian church. The man tried to enter the church yesterday but was spotted thanks to heightened security. He then detonated the blast, killing only himself. No group has claimed responsibility for the attack. Christians are roughly 10% of the population in the majority Muslim nation and have been targeted by Islamic militants. 4 days of ferocious fighting between Afghan forces and the Taliban have claimed about 100 Afghan policemen and soldiers and at least the lives of 20 civilians. The violence began Friday with insurgents overtaking several parts of a key provincial capital in a massive assault. The U.S. has sent military advisors to help the Afghan forces. The Vatican press office says Pope Francis is following the Chile sex abuse crisis closely. The comment comes after the Holy Father met privately with in the Vatican with a Chilean bishop last Friday.
He wanted to do this in a very private way with a very specific environment, which is come home, tell me what is happening, come to my home and tell me what are you doing, how can I help you?
The meeting included Bishop Juan Ignacio Gonzalez of San Bernardo and Ana Maria Celis Brunet, president of the Chilean National Council for the Prevention of Abuses and Accompaniment of Victims. The Vatican's Secretary of State says Pope Francis will be reaffirming the Church's teaching on marriage and family on his upcoming trip to Ireland. Cardinal Pietro Parolin made the comments after Mass this Sunday. He was consecrating the Cathedral of Cassino, about 75 miles south of Rome. The World Meeting of Families takes place next week in Dublin. The event is held every 3 years and focuses on the central importance of marriage and the family as the cornerstone of our lives, of society, and of the Church. The Holy Father will join participants at the end of the conference. Catholic news agency's Vatican analyst Andrea Gaiaducci spoke to Cardinal Parolin and joins us from Rome. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
The Irish have voted to legalize same-sex marriage, and Ireland voted this year to overturn a ban on abortion. Did Cardinal Parolin give you an idea of how the Pope is going to try to change Ireland's mind when it comes to these issues?
Yeah, Cardinal Parolin tells me the World Meeting of Families will be an opportunity for the Holy Father and the Church to proclaim the gospel of the family, what he called the gospel of the family. By that, the Cardinal is referring to the Church teaching on marriage and family life. The Church teaches that marriage is the union of a man and a woman with openness to life. Parolin says the Church is not against anyone, and he was referring probably to gay couples. There he said that the Church is a message of happiness and joy for all the people. The Cardinal says the Church offered this message with humility, but also very firmly and with great determination. Ireland is a Catholic country, as you might recall, but like many countries in Europe, it has struggled with Church teaching on key issues like same-sex marriage and abortion.
Now, let's move to South America. The political crisis in Nicaragua is a big concern. The president imposed cuts to the Social Security system, and the Church has tried to play a mediating role between President Ortega's government, and protesters. And on Friday, we learned Vice President Pence and Cardinal Parolin talked on the phone. What did the Cardinal tell you about that phone conversation?
Well, Cardinal Parolin said that the phone call was initiated by the Vice President, who wanted to exchange impressions with the Holy See on the situation in Nicaragua. The purpose of the call was to emphasize the importance of dialogue, according to Vice President Pence's office. The Vatican Secretary of State says the problem can only be resolved through a serious national dialogue involving all parties. The Catholic Church and its leaders have often been targeted of violence in Nicaragua.
Another global issue the Vatican is dealing with is a possible agreement between China and the Holy See on the appointment of bishops. Is that deal still on?
Well, the talks are still ongoing. At the center of the deal between the Holy See and China is the appointment of bishops. China wants to appoint bishops, while the Holy See demands the right to do so. That's where the tension lies. The deal was considered imminent in the past months, but still nothing has been said about that. The Cardinal says there's still a long way before a deal is made.
Thank you so much for relaying information about your interview with the number 2 man in the Vatican, Cardinal Parolin. Andrea Gaiaducci, Vatican analyst for Catholic News Agency. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up, an analysis of media coverage of the clergy sex abuse scandal. And why the Secretary of Defense says he's changed his mind about the Space Force. White nationalists and counter-protesters gathered yesterday in Washington, D.C. on the 1-year anniversary of deadly violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. The marches were mostly peaceful, with a few arrests reported. There were protests in Charlottesville as well. 4 people were arrested there. 1 police officer was attacked but wasn't seriously injured. Joining me now is Vince Coglianese, editorial director at the Daily Caller, host of Mornings on the Mall on WMAL Radio. Vince, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much, Lauren.
Let's take a look at what President Trump tweeted ahead of Sunday's rallies. Quote, "The riots in Charlottesville a year ago resulted in senseless death and division. We must come together as a nation. I condemn all types of racism and acts of violence. Peace to all Americans." This is a different tune than a year ago. He received a lot of criticism for his comments where he said there were very fine people on both sides. So how do you think that reaction a year ago influenced his reaction this year?
I don't think there's any question he had it in mind, and he wanted to nip it in the bud before this thing even happened. Who knew what the event was actually going to be this weekend? The president couldn't even have predicted how it turned out. But I think he decided in this instance, he looks back, he probably sees that as a mistake, and he wanted to get ahead of it and say, look, racism's bad. And he was unequivocal about it. That's the right approach here.
I want to turn to a story that's also received a lot of attention in the last weeks. Let's take a look at the front page of today's Washington Post. It's right there. The headline is "New Sex Scandals Roiling the Vatican." This is a headline a little over a month after we first learned of sex abuse allegations against former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. How do you think the media are portraying and handling the coverage of this story?
I think by and large, the history of coverage of the Catholic Church is often included the press sort of with like a patronizing touch and go. They'll come in, they'll focus on it, and they'll leave. There's not a tremendous amount of affinity for what the Catholic Church has actually built and developed and the good things that it's done for the world. It's sort of an opportunity to sort of go after when it has a glaring black eye. In this case, the Church clearly does have a black eye. They're working on it. Pope Francis, I think, is working on it with some urgency and some fervency. But the media, by and large, I think kind of covers it as if there's a unique problem to the Catholic Church, when it's not true. So much of our culture has a bit of a rot to it that needs to be addressed. It just so happens the Catholic Church has standards, and when it fails to live up to it, the media, I think, places a heavier burden on the Church for failing in that way.
Do you think the Church is handling it effectively from a media perspective?
From a media perspective, no, probably not. I mean, because otherwise you'd have the Washington Post probably writing a much more glowing assessment of the Church's efforts to combat sex abuse. But I think the primary responsibility here of the Church is to focus on what's going on in-house and to worry about public relations considerations at the tail end of the things that they need to be concerned with.
Do you think we're seeing more transparency from the Church than we did in 2002? During those sex scandals? I
think seeking and obtaining the resignation of Cardinal McCarrick was quite a big statement by Pope Francis, and he continues to engage with high-ranking officials stepping down in the Catholic Church. that is a pretty big showing on the part of the church, and specifically Pope Francis, that he takes this seriously, and it should send shockwaves throughout the church and a signal that men of virtue are what's expected.
Thank you so much. Vince Coglianese, editorial director at the Daily Caller, host of Mornings on the Mall on WMAL Radio.
Thank you, Lauren.
Secretary of Defense James Mattis defends his reversal on creating a Space Force after opposing moves in Congress last year to create it.
We are trying to define every challenge and then figure out what is the best solution for that. I was not against setting up a Space Force. What I was against was rushing to do that before we defined those problems.
His comments come after the vice president said the White House is pushing to make Space Force a military branch by the year 2020. Up next, the Pope has a message to tens of thousands of young people. And the host of EWTN's A Force for Good has advice for students heading back to school.
A tutto questo no. Cosa si dice a tutto questo? Insieme.
The Holy Father asked the 90,000 faithful packed in St. Peter's Square this Sunday how we will reject evil. He told the crowd it means saying no to temptations and to the culture of death. On Saturday, the Holy Father advised young Italian Catholics to pursue their dreams.
Pessimismo. Rischio, sognare e avanti.
Speaking to tens of thousands in Rome's Circus Maximus, the Holy Father encouraged them to take risks and to dream. This weekend's pilgrimage of young people was a preview ahead of October's Synod on Youth. An author and assistant business professor says telling young adults to find a job by finding their passion is bad career advice. Jay Richards, also the host of EWTN's Force for Good, writes on stream.com this month, quote, "Since when did we decide it's wise to encourage teenagers who need jobs just to follow their emotions? How different is follow your passion from do what feels good? In almost any other context, this would be dismissed as, well, stupid advice." Jay Richards joins me now. He's the host of the EWTN program, A Force for Good. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Lauren. Good to be with you.
If young people should not follow their passions, what about pursuing happiness?
Well, pursuing happiness, you got to define terms. Of course, this is part of the American dream. But if you look at what Thomas Jefferson in this case meant by happiness, he didn't mean happiness in terms of kind of short-term titillating desire. He was actually talking about really the fulfillment of our natures. And so to be happy was actually to pursue virtue. So if you define the terms properly, I'd say that's fine. But pursuing or following your passion, I just think for kids that are 17 years old, just about to go to college or out of high school, it's bad advice.
Let's drill down on virtue. You mentioned Thomas Jefferson. I was struck by the quote in your book. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, "Happiness is secured through virtue. It is a good attained by man's own will." And George Washington, in his first inaugural speech, also said that there exists an economy and a course of nature, an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness. So let's drill down on virtue. You say the top three: courage, anti-fragility, and altruism, among others. What do you mean by that?
Well, those are all virtues that I think people need anytime, but especially to succeed in a high-tech information economy. Anti-fragility is the weird one that people aren't used to, but that basically means don't just be strong, don't just be able to take failure or harm, but actually be able to improve from it. So when things are changing, industry's changing quickly, you have to have the courage to fail. You also have to have the ability to learn from failure so that you're better the next time. I also argue that you need altruism. If you actually want to have a job and succeed, find out what people want, find out what they need and what you're good at, and then find a way to meet that. That's actually, I think, a much better way to pursue happiness than to just say, well, what's your fancy? What's your bliss at the moment? Pursue that. I think they're getting the order of things wrong.
I have to tell you, the reason you're here is because my son is going to college for the first time on Friday, and I'm looking for anything to hold on to tell him. And you know, one of the things that you mentioned in this great book was that struggle in life plays a really important part in a virtuous life.
It does. In fact, it's essential to a virtuous life. Virtue is about it's an act of the will in which we do something we don't want to do over and over, and so we work with our bodies. It becomes a habit, then it works its way back into our being so we become something better than we were before. This is why a child that doesn't know how to play the piano, she's free to plunk out notes on the piano, but if she really wants to be free to make music, it's going to take 10 years of hard work and habitual practice to pull it off. And
what
I think
is that, 10,000 hours or
well,
something?
10,000 hours is the
right.
popular idea that Malcolm Gladwell said. It's actually even more complicated than that, but it's years of focused attention in which you're doing that rather than other things. There's really no shortcut to that.
Jay Richards, I know you also wrote a book about grief of parents of kids going off to school. This is going to be a theme all week long for me on EWTN, and I am going to read that article.
Yeah, please do.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jay Richards, host of EWTN's A Force for Good. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.